Good afternoon. My name is Abdullah Shah, and today I'm going to present the topic which is FOB, free on board contracts. In this presentation, we will talk about the responsibility of the seller under the free on board contracts and the responsibility of the buyer under the free on board contracts. In this presentation, we will also talk about the key feature of the free on board contract. So, what is the thing which make the free on board contracts totally different from the other international sale of good contracts? And as well as in this presentation we will talk about the advantages and limitation of the free on-board contracts, and definitely finally we will talk about the conclusion of this presentation. So let's start. Yeah, first of all we should know about the free on-board contracts. So the free on-board is the basic form of contract of international sale of goods, and this contracts the major role of the seller is to place the good on the ship. So, by introducing this special kind of contracts, the responsibility of the risk was shifted from the seller to the buyer. And this contract is mostly employed in the all international sale of goods because of its simplicity, and this contract specifically explain the responsibility of the both parties. So the free on board now you can say is a form of international sale of good contracts. So, in this presentation, the second thing is we should talk about the responsibility of the seller, the responsibility of the buyer, and the key feature, advantages, and limitation of the free outboard contracts. So, now let's talk about the responsibility of the seller. The responsibility of the seller under the FOB contract is that the very first responsibility of the seller is to delivery of the goods to the port. So the seller makes sure the delivery of the good to the agreed spot. And the second point, that it makes sure to prepare the goods according to the contracts. The second responsibility of the seller is to loading of the goods. So the seller makes sure that he loaded the agreed or the thing which was listed, which was mentioned in the contracts. And the second thing is that the seller makes sure that the goods are loaded safely. So the third thing which come under the responsibility of the seller is to hand over the documentation. So the very first documentation which is to be handled by the seller to the buyer is the bill of lading. Another thing is the uh, uh, is the bill of you can say commercial invoice, and the third one is the packing list and the other required documents. So the seller must provide these following documents to the buyer or to the shipper. And the fourth one come as the responsibility as the export, you can say the custom. So the seller is responsible under the free on board contracts to pay the export, or you can say to clear the custom clearance, and also pay the cost and tax of the goods. Now let's talk about the responsibility of the buyer. As we studied the responsibility of the seller under the FOB contract, there is some responsibility of the buyer as well under the FOB contract. So let's talk about the responsibility of the buyer. So the very first responsibility, so the responsibility of the buyer started once the goods uh, of the contracts as delivered to the shipper. So the responsibility, the list of responsibility come after when the good are shifted. So as we know in the FOB contracts, when the seller placed the good on the ship, so the responsibility shifted from the seller to the buyer. So now the responsibility is started. So the first responsibility under the FOB contracts of the buyer is that now the buyer is responsible for the loss of goods and any damages which occur to the goods once the goods are loaded in the ship. Now, the second responsibility of the buyer is to make the procedure and to carry the goods in a safely way to its destination. So this is the responsibility of the buyer. The third one responsibility of the buyer under the FOB contract is that he should pay the import tax of the goods. And the fourth one responsibility under the FOB contract of the buyer is that he should pay the money to the seller which they agreed in the agreements. So there are many other responsibility of the buyer, but these are the main responsibility of the buyer under the FOB contracts. So no, now let's talk about the key feature of the FOB contracts. That what are the feature which make this contract totally different from the other contracts. So the FOB contracts is the special kind of contracts which shifted the responsibility of the seller to the buyer once the seller loaded the goods into the ship. So previously, in the case of Peroni versus Candia Company Limited, and you can say in 1954, the responsibility of the risk was lies on the seller. But in 1949, the Julia settled this matter and he said the responsibility should be shifted from the seller to the buyer once the seller place the goods on the ship. So the key feature of this contract is that it clearly specify and explain the responsibility of the both party. And the key feature is it shifted the responsibility of the seller to the buyer. So now let's talk about the advantages of this contract. So there are many advantages of the free on board contracts and the international sale of goods. So the very first, the advantages of free on board contract is that it's clearly defined and explain the responsibility of the both party. It means it clarified the responsibility of the carrier and the ship. And another the very basic response advantages of the free onboard contract as that it's allow buyer to arrange the ship of its own choice. It's mean now the responsibility of the loss of goods are shifted from the seller to the buyer. So now the buyer is supposed to manage a ship for to delivery of good, that it must be clear, and the good the ship must be and very clear and good in order to transport the good from one destination to another destination. So it give a very specific target, or you can say it allow the buyer to choose the ship of its own choice. So now let's talk about the limitation of this contract. So the limitation of this contract is that the dispute may be arise after or over unloading and accuracy of documents and something. So this contract are very limited ones, because it's not applied to the most of other contract. It's only limited to some kind of contracts. And finally, let's talk about the conclusion of the free on board contracts. So as we studied and as explained, the free on board contract is a very good kind of contract for the seller, because it shifted the responsibility of the seller of the risk to the buyer. So we can say that the free on board contract is favor the seller, not the buyer. But at the same time, it also favor the buyer, because it's put some responsibility on the seller, that the seller must cautiously and accurately place the goods on the ship. So the responsibility of the risk passed to the buyer once the seller pass the goods to the ship accurately. So we can say this is the special kind of contract which favor the both of the party. So this was my presentation, and I hope this will be good, and thank you so much.